And so we come to our final speaker this afternoon, who is Michael Cronin himself. If there was ever an occasion where it was appropriate to say that our next speaker needs no introduction, then it's now. But let me say a few words of introduction nevertheless. Michael Cronin is 1776 Professor of French at Trinity College, Dublin, and Director of the Trinity Centre for Literary and Cultural Translation. Over his distinguished career, Michael has published extensively on language, culture, translation, and travel writing. In addition to the titles I mentioned earlier, Translating Ireland, Eco-Translation, Irish and Ecology, Michael's many groundbreaking studies that have redefined so many aspects of the translation studies landscape include Across the Lines, Travel Language Translation from 2000, Translation and Globalization, 2003, Translation and Identity, 2006, Translation Goes to the Movies, 2009, The Expanding World Towards the Politics of Microspection, 2012, and Translation in the Digital Age, 2013. Michael is a Fellow of Trinity College Dublin, an elected member of the Royal Irish Academy and of the Academia Europea, and an officer in the Ordre des Palmes Académiques. Michael, a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Duncan, for that very, very kind introduction. And I would like to thank not just you, but everybody in the British Centre for Literary Translation, Joe Drugan, Anna Good, really everybody's made this event possible. I'm very, very grateful to you. When I got up this morning, my partner asked me, how does it feel to have a two-day conference devoted to your work? And I said it could be summed up in one word, which is terrifying, because you wonder sometimes about the legacy of things that you write, and you know what kind of afterlives they have, and also the kinds of sets of expectations that can set up. But I have to say how deeply grateful I am to the colleagues who accepted the invitations to speak at this conference, and because I'm aware of the time and energy that's needed to prepare these presentations, and I'm deeply grateful. I really do feel that I'm in a community of friends in this two-day gathering. So what I'm going to do now is, if I can get my screen to share, and so I hope that can be, can everybody see the screen now? Yes, good. Okay, so I decided in thinking about eco-translation, that book came out in 2017. We're now in 2021, and you know, thinking about that book and the ideas in it in the period since it came out. And one of the words that came to me to kind of characterize what was a feature of the period that we're living through is a word that was coined by an Australian philosopher, Glenn Albrecht, in 2003. This word, solastalgia, which is to do with the kinds of psychic or existential distress that people feel as the result of climate change. That sense of discomfort, the sense in which nostalgia, for example, might have been a kind of a longing for home. But what solastalgia means is that you become displaced, alienated from the place that you previously thought of as home. So thinking about that sense of dislocation, thinking about that sense of distress and discomfort, I wanted to try and situate this in terms of how, as the other speakers have done, before me to try and situate translation in this picture. One of the points that Bruno Latour and Timothy Lenton have argued recently is that when we talk about the Anthropocene, it's not just a question of a kind of geophysical event, that what we're really talking about is a profound cultural paradigm shift that affects every area of our life and thought, our science, our politics, our notion of ethics, morality, the arts, and so on. That in a sense, what it is it's a kind of a replaying of the Copernican revolution, where it involves a change not just in what is observed, but the way in which any observation is made. Now, what I want to argue is that the way in which we have thought about or tried to conceptualize this notion of solastalgia to ourselves has been, I would argue, predominantly in the major mode. And I want to give you a very brief illustration of this. I want to illustrate it by a film that is now gloriously forgotten, except by a few film buffs or aficionados. It was a film that came out in 1961. The director, Eugène Laurier, filmed this film in Ireland. It begins a mile and a half from where I'm giving you this talk. And it's basically about a group of treasure hunters who come to this island called Nara, and they're looking for sunken treasure. In doing this, they experience a disturbance. They have to come off their ship and come ashore. They come ashore to a Gaelic and Irish-speaking island. They're English speakers. This is a very kind of tense moment because the speakers of minority language don't want to speak the majority language. They're accused of acting in bad faith, that they could translate themselves if they wanted to, but they didn't. So there's this kind of rather tense standoff. But what interests me in this major minor encounter is the fact of the creature, this sort of prehistoric sea creature that comes up from the deep, that they capture, they bring to London to be exhibited at Battersea Fun Fair, and then, as the expression goes, all hell breaks loose. So I want to show you a very short excerpt from the trailer to give you an idea of what this film is like or about.
No motion picture of our time has ever unleashed shock spectacle of such scope and realism as up from the depths of prehistoric mystery rages Virgo. The headlines of the world blaze the fabulous story of this monster from another age, catapulted from some vast sub-ocean cavern by unprecedented volcanic action. And the headlines scream the story of the reckless skin divers who captured the monster and put it on exhibition. Sam! Pull out! Drop the nets! What do you think you're doing? Take it easy.
I can't let him go back to the sea where he belongs.
Why?
Maybe to save his silly skins for you.
Hurry, 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 the King Togo! But the headlines do not record the story of a little boy who had a curious sympathy and understanding for the fantastic creature. What strange secret does he know that scientists only suspect?
You're trying to say there may be a fully grown one of these things around somewhere? How big would a full-grown one be?
An approximate guess? The infant? The adult?
That would make it nearly 200 feet tall.
Wreaking terrible vengeance against the civilization that has captured its offspring. Towering over the cities of the world as millions flee its awesome terror.
Okay, so what you can see from this brief extract that I've given you is very much a kind of fairly typical representation of what happens in terms of ecological menace. It's gargantuan, it's overwhelming, it's very much pitched in a minor mode. It's very much what you might call a kind of a cataclysm of addition. The people piling into the streets, the creature that's looming over the houses and institutions and building of London. So this is what we might call the experience of solastalgia in the major mode. But when we think about what our experience of the last year and a half has been, what we have experienced is solastalgia in the minor mode. We have this microscopic organism, this COVID virus, which has unleashed what we might call a cataclysm, not of addition, but of subtraction, where people are not piling into the streets, but as we can see here from the empty streets of Dublin, are being pulled away from, are being withdrawn from the streets into their houses and dwelling places. And of course, what we know about this virus is that it is very much characteristic of the type of zoonotic disease that results from the violation and destruction of ecological habitats, the violation of particular species boundaries, the proliferation of global air travel. In other words, as Frank M. Snowden argues in his book, Epidemics and Society, every age gets the pandemic it deserves. So that this kind of coronavirus pandemic and both the origins of it and the spread of the are things that are very much predicated on a particular type of economic growth, social organization that are in turn predicated on a particular attitude to the planet and the environment. So if we think about then solastalgia, not so much in the major mode that we're accustomed to, but the minor mode that has invaded or has entered into our lives, how do we think about this then in terms of minoritization? One of the points that's made by Val Plumwood, the Australian ecofeminist, is that one of the consequences of a particular nature-culture dichotomy and the kind of the separation of reason, mind, and consciousness from what, I'm quoting Plumwood here, the lower order that comprises the body, the woman, the animal, and the pre-human, is there was a kind of a minoritization of various constituent groups and part of the world that we inhabit, which of course includes the environment and the natural world and other groupings in that, which of course include not only animals and insects, but many other groups in our society, which we look at in a moment. But the essential point that Plumwood is making is that the triumph of a particular kind of anthropocentric ecocidal viewpoint was predicated on the minoritization of vast tracts of our lived worlds and the different communities that inhabit that more than human world. And of course, this notion of minoritization is a one that we are familiar with in translation studies, because we know that despite our best efforts, we constantly have to fight against or to struggle against the minoritization of translators' rights in terms of working conditions, in terms of remuneration, in terms of the struggle against data and labor extractivism in new forms of translation practice, the very uneven institutional implantation of translation studies in universities across the planet, and of course the minoritized position of translated titles, in particular languages such as English. So what I want to suggest then is that this thinking about Solastalgia in a minor mode, looking at that sense of complementarity then with minoritization as it plays out in a particular form of anthropocentrism and in the role of translation, invites us to think about different kinds of minority. So in this lecture, I want to look at four kinds of minority. One is what I'm going to call relational minority, thinking about agents from the standpoint of eco-translation. The second is what I'm going to call situational minority, which is looking more specifically at the notion of place. Thirdly, I want to look at what I'm going to call positional minority, which is to do with the axis on which our notion of the globe and global politics and global translation politics turns or rotates. And finally, the question of time with respect to the notion of chrono minority. So starting with relational minority, I want to begin with the words of an indigenous translator from Mexico, Raimundo Isidro Alabez, who is a speaker of one of the indigenous languages of Mexico, Heneñu, spoken by the Neñu people. And he published an essay on his translation practice in a book that came out in 2010, Beyond Words, Translating the World, edited by Susan Uriu. And in talking about his translation and what's kind of involved in this translation practice, Alabez says the following: in our case, the Heneñu language transports readers into another reality, using its own words to name the flora, fauna, and life forces. As in other indigenous languages throughout the world, those objects and organisms will live on indefinitely as they're part of the community's identity. So in other words, what he sees the translating the language, what it involves is engaging with the world beyond the language. It's engaging with the flora, it's engaging with the fauna, it's engaging with the energies and the life forces in the world in which these texts, songs, recitations, stories, myths are situated. So one could argue that in describing his practice as an indigenous translator of an indigenous language, working between an indigenous language and a major language like Spanish, what in fact he is formulating in effect is what Timo Maran, the theorist from the University of Tartu in Estonia, has described in an article that was published 3 weeks ago in Biosemiotics as the eco-semiosphere. The eco-semiosphere he defines as follows: as a semiotic system that comprises all species with their umwelts and the diverse semiotic relations, including humans with their culture, and that they have in a given ecosystem, as well as the material support structures that enable the eco-semiosphere to thrive. So precisely what he's doing is giving formulation to what Carolyn was describing earlier as that kind of semiotic space that's inhabited by different entities, different groups, different communities. The example that he gives of an ecosemiosphere is the kind of coastal meadow that you will find in parts of the United Kingdom and Scandinavia, in the Baltic countries, where you have, if you like, the physical dimension to it, which are the kinds of the effects of winds, the effects of floods, the biological nature of the organisms that inhabit the coastal meadow. Then there's the human cultural activities such as grazing, haymaking, and so on. These particular kinds of habitats, which are saline tolerant, so therefore they attract particular kinds of plants and coastal bird species. So this makes them unique, but of course they're continually open to influences and arrivals, both human, physiological and meteorological from elsewhere. In this kind of coastal meadow, you get the development of specific ecological codes. So for example, the gulls and waders develop particularly loud calls, which allow them to overcome the effects of the noise produced by the wind or waves. And of course, what they carry with them are specific kinds of local knowledge. And part of local knowledge, of course, are the languages that are spoken by the people who inhabit these coastal meadows. And what Robert Macfarlane has demonstrated so wonderfully in his book, Landmarks, is how rich and extensive so many languages are in the kinds of words that they have to engage precisely with this ecosemiosphere, to both acknowledge and describe and interact with the multiplicity of agencies that are at work in these spaces. So what that means then is that if we are to develop any notion of a viable Earth community, if we are to develop in any meaningful sense the kind of relational ontology that thinkers like Rosie Braidotti speak about, and was mentioned by Carolyn, then we have to think about what are the conditions of what Serge Audier has described in his recent work, which hasn't been translated to English as yet, La Cité écologique, as a biotic democracy. So in other words, that what we need to do in the age of the Anthropocene is to expand our notion of the democratic to include the more than human world. In other words, we've got to think about the interaction with, the participation of, the nature of agency in that more than human world. And what Aymeric Caron, another French thinker about animal rights, has argued is that we need to think about sort of what is going to be the communicative space. So in other words, if we are to think about the kinds of rights that various entities in our more than human world are to enjoy, then we have to think about how we are going to establish forms or networks of communication. Because one of the things that Caron argues is that when we look at the way in which particular human groups gradually, with great difficulty, acquired particular rights, whether it be to do with gender, whether to do with race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, that very often it was to do with the expanding of what he calls a circle of moral concern. And that circle of moral concern was to do with the development of a form of empathetic imagination, which was to try and imagine what it was like to be someone not yourself. So if you like, we've been doing this in human terms, but I would argue the real translational challenge of our age is that we have to do this in more than human terms. And this is where, of course, in any notion of what I call zoonocracy, the democratic organization of a more than human world, if we're to think about a zoonocratic politics, then at the heart of that has got to be the notion of translation. In other words, how all the constituent groups, communities in that eco-semisphere are to interact with each other is profoundly a translational problem and translational issue, and puts translation studies at the heart of current political and environmental debates. Of course, one of the questions that we can ask ourselves is to what extent this is a right and proper thing to do. One of the arguments that's been put forward by Patricia McCormack, who is speaks for the abolitionist movement, who basically argued that the only way of, if you like, saving of the species on the planet is to bring about the extinction of the human species. So this involves stopping having children, looking at what she calls forms of death activism, and basically all of these practices that would bring about the gradual disappearance of humans. And she argues, with respect to language and communication, that abolitionists are activists against all use of animals, acknowledging that communication is fatally human, so we can never know modes of non-human communication, and to do so is both hubris and materially detrimental to non-humans. So basically what she's arguing for is a kind of radical untranslatability, that the only way in which we can ecologically come up with a sustainable form of existence on our planet is to acknowledge this radical untranslatability, and not to refuse the activity of translation in any form. This notion of the untranslatable, of course, has been critiqued by Lawrence Venuti in his recent work against or contra instrumentalism, where he argues that to promote a notion of untranslatability so as to stigmatize and rule out the study of translation in its many forms, humanistic, pragmatic, and technical, as well as the institutional and economic conditions in which it is practiced, any such exclusion is effectively to abdicate the status quo by withdrawing from the areas where social struggles can occur. In other words, what Venuti is arguing is that translation is far too important an activity to be disengaged from. In other words, that the consequences of translation, the consequences of the refusal to translate from a political, social, cultural, and I would argue environmental point of view are so grave that the truly ethical stance is to think about the possibility, the generative possibilities of translation rather than the contrary. One of the ways I think that we can think about this in terms of how we come up with a viable notion of translatability that avoids the kinds of anthropocentric pitfalls that McCormack warns us against, is to think about again about the notion of anthropomorphism, and to think again about the notion of animism. One of the things that Deirdre Johnson argues is she talks about what she calls a form of responsible anthropomorphism, a way of knowing about and knowing with animals, not based on our shared sentience, our shared place in the world, or any other such abstract philosophical argument, but in our actual relationships, our day-to-day living and working. In other words, what Johnson's arguing in terms of how she would conceive of the ecosemiosphere and the role of translation is that we have to think about, or what we need to think about is that kind of zoonocracy, that more than human world, in terms of how we actually engage with and interact with animals and different species and different presences in the more than human world, such as mountains, rivers, and so on. And so, rather than some kind of, almost like another minds theory, that that what you're doing is you're looking at how in that day-to-day interaction you negotiate a translational relationship. And this, if you like, is something that echoes a point that's made by the ethnographer Alex Hornberg when he says, rather than viewing knowledge as either representation or construction, animism suggests the intermediate view that knowledge is a relationship that shapes both the knower and the known, right? So rather than the idea of the human projecting things onto the more than human, or if you like, trying to represent the more than human in particular ways, what you look at is how particular kinds of relationship evolve in interaction, in precisely a kind of translational space. Timothy Ingold, the British social anthropologist, talks about animacy, and he says, animacy is not a property of persons imaginatively projected onto the things which they perceive themselves to be surrounded. Rather, it is the dynamic, transformative potential of the entire field of relations within which beings of all kinds, more or less person-like or thing-like, continually and reciprocally bring one another into existence. So in other words, what Ingold argues is that kind of the traditional sort of patriarchal, occidentocentric critique of animism in indigenous worldviews is profoundly wrong, because it has this kind of notion that it's simply a kind of projection of human properties and ideas onto the more than human world, whereas he would argue is that animism is about the emergent relationships in that kind of translational space between the human and the more than human. In a book that I reviewed recently for a newspaper here, The Ardent Swarm, which was written by the Tunisian novelist Yamen Manet and translated from French into English by Lara Vergniaud. The main character is a beekeeper called Sidi. And Sidi finds his beehive is decimated by an attack of hornets. The hornets, which have been smuggled in a container, so kind of like a kind of metonym for the globalization of container traffic and the violation of ecological habitats. But it's at the end of the novel, he manages to bring another kind of migrant in, a Japanese queen bee, which contributes to the kind of the revival of his bee colonies. And there's this passage in it, was using gentle movements and his agricultural expertise, he had introduced her into a hive where she was accepted. She soon produced several generations of forager bees and new promising queens. But had she transmitted her knowledge, would his bees be able to defend themselves from the monsters? He didn't know. And it's that didn't know, the fact that there's uncertainty, the fact that there is doubt, but he's still attempting to engage in a form of communication, but it's a form of communication that emerges from the translational interaction between CD and the beehives, that we get some kind of glimpse of forms of relational minority, a kind of glimpse of the kind of the role that translation might play in a zoonocratic future. The second form of minority that I want to look at is what I'm going to call situational minority, which is not so much about the entities that are co-present in our more than human world, but places themselves. One of the experiences that we've all had, it's been alluded to by Federico, it's been alluded to by Loredana, it's been alluded to by Carolyn, is our experience of confinement, of being restricted to a particular place, the repeated lockdowns, and so on. And this is presented as a kind of exceptional, aberrant phenomenon. But one could argue that in a sense, one of the characteristics of modernity is that we are in perpetual lockdown. From the age of preschool, we end up living through forms of confinement. As Pierre Rabhi, the Moroccan environmental activist, says, you know, from preschool to university, humans are kept inside. And of course, what that means then is that our forms of thinking, the way that we think about the world, are profoundly shaped by these spaces in which we are confined, from preschool to primary school, to high school, to university, to our office buildings, to our university buildings. We are perpetually kept inside. And one of the arguments that the essayist Chris Arthur has made is that millions of us have become more defined by the time we spend indoors rather than outside. As a result, we've lost touch with the natural world. Those with the most pronounced indoor sensibilities can't identify even the commonest species of birds, insects, and plants in their locality. So in other words, what we have then is we are asking people to concern themselves about an environment, about a climate, about a natural world that they have increasingly less actual physical phenomenological contact with. And of course, one of the things that we find with cognitive capitalism is the relentless digitization of activities, which kind of amplifies this sense of disconnection through our screens from the more than human world. So what we might argue then is for the necessity of promoting thinking not so much indoors as thinking outdoors. And how does this thinking indoors then relate to translation? I want to refer briefly here to the very interesting work that's been done by Margaret Newton, who is a theorist of Anishinaabe descent, and who published an article in this collection at Translations Edge on what she calls Anishinaabe translation studies. What she argues is that how and this has already been mentioned by Loredana, the kind of the metaphorical bias in particular ways of thinking about translation. But when we look at the idea of translation in Anishinaabe language, the word for translation, or the idea of translation, is anakanatun, which Newton says is it's a kind of stringing of things together. And it's a word that echoes another word in the Anishinaabe language for an ancestor or a grandparent. And so she argues perhaps the best way to understand both translation and ancestry is through the action of connection. As we translate, we connect languages and cultures. Our language also connects us to those who used it before and those who will carry us into the future. So this kind of notion of connection, on the one hand, it kind of relates to time, and we look at this when we come to the idea of chrono-minority, but it's also, and this sort of echoes the earlier observation of the indigenous translator from Mexico, Alves, is the notion of translation as a way of connecting us to the world beyond language, that more than human world. It's setting up those connections and the kind of knowledge that the ancestors bring with them about that more than human world. So what I would argue is that one of the things that we need to think about is, just as we need to formulate the notion or think about the notion of thinking outdoors, bringing our thinking outdoors, I would argue we need to think about bringing our translation outdoors. We need to think about translating outdoors. And it's interesting that there's a kind of a clue as to how this might be represented or formulated in what is the kind of classic iconographic representation of translation in the Western tradition. And this is the figure of Saint Jerome, because what we find when we look at the kind of the iconic representations of Jerome in the Western tradition is two radically different representations of this figure. On the one hand, we find him fully clothed in his cardinal robes, inside with the kind of the woven fabrics, with the man-made objects, the utensils of his trade. So it's very much the kind of the translator translating indoors. But the other image that is widespread in the Western tradition is one that we find here in Giovanni Bellini's depiction of Saint Jerome, is the barely clothed Jerome, who is outside. Very often he's near a cave, and he is not just, if you like, surrounded in a kind of human space, surrounded by his man-made objects, but he is surrounded by other species, most typically the lion, but we can see a host of other species in Bellini's representation here, and of course different plants, trees, and so on. So in this shift, if you like, in this kind of iconic representation from the translator indoors to the translator outdoors, I would argue is a way of thinking about place itself and place and the environment. This picture here is of the Slieve League cliffs in the northwest of Ireland, in County Donegal. And they were the subject of a poetry competition in the 18th century between two poets, and the winning entry, if you like, which was adjudicated by the one of the local landowners, was this poem by a man called Seamus O'Didachine. So this is a verse from the poem that he wrote. Is exnal chnachan anya, torkort gal is Paulus, il wali bana agus toplish na slí. Is gomor vintje an sleve a glúsius na kéite, an bansje agus feeste is le héides got tír. Bí slua fná dégach dúlach ja éidi is chlásig héidi a mréige agus píb. So in English, Slieve League, at the bottom of Cnachan Anya, there are bright yards and parlours, whitewashed walls and players seated to chess. Hundreds come to the great hostelries of the mountain for play and feasting, and they come from every country. There are a host of fine featured, well-dressed women from Greece, and harp strings are played and pipes. Now, what's interesting here is the kind of the dual presence of translation. So this is a poet who is describing a geomorphological feature of his landscape. And what, of course, he's doing in this poem is he's animating in a particular way that landscape. Now, what he, in so doing, the kind of way in which he does it, when he talks about the fine featured, well-dressed, the allusion there to Greece, itself is a reference to the translation of a classical epic from Latin in particular, but also Greek, into to medieval Irish. So from the 10th century onwards, we get these translations of the Aeneid into Mjachtonesa, Lucan's Pharsali, which becomes Ancacarta, and so on. So the kind of the tropes, the images from these poems are translated into Irish and then become disseminated into the vernacular tradition. So these kind of translated tropes become a way of engaging with or thinking about or animating the particular landscape. But of course, another way in which the poets in other verses of this poem that the poet engages with the land is to use particular formulations, particular words, particular phrases in the Gaelic language, which describe certain biological features, certain geomorphological features, certain physical features, and which, in order to translate them into English, you have to think about the kind of physical or material landscape that the poet is describing. Because, for example, the term of ecosemisphere that Maran uses in his writings was a term that he took from a scholar called Sewers in his work on early Irish literature and the representation of the natural world in this literature, and the kind of the interface between the cultural and the physical, between the linguistic and the natural. So, in other words, what I want to argue is for a kind of indigenous hermeneutics. One of the arguments that has emerged from the writings of theorists like Margaret Newton, who thought about Indigenous translation, is the predominant translation paradigm for Indigenous translation was extractivist, was instrumentalist, was precisely the kind of approach to translation that's been so heavily critiqued by thinkers like Lawrence Venuti, where it's the idea that you basically, what translation is about is extracting the essential message, the essential meaning, and then bringing this across into the other language. So the idea of translation then becomes instrumentalist, it becomes extractivist, it becomes appropriative. So the encounter that many Indigenous peoples would have with translation, for example, through the activity of Christian missionaries and the activities of conversion would be very much this kind of the instrumentalist expropriation of their language in order to convert them to Christianity. But we also find variations of this playing out in ethnography, documentary history, and so on, the kinds of histories that are then consumed indoors. What I would like to argue is that a hermeneutic notion of translation, a translation that precisely picks up on what Indigenous translators themselves have expressed, which is all about the opening up, the generative, the generation of plurality of meanings, brings us in a different direction. For example, Patricia Nguwanse, in her translator's note to a collection of translations between English and Anishinaabe language, talks about stories and poetry in the native language play a particularly important role in language revitalization as they bring the language to life. In other words, what she sees translation as doing as being generative in a plural way, not being reductionist in an instrumental way. And this is precisely what restorative ecology, for example, seeks to do, is to restore the plurality, the living plurality of landscape, as opposed to the reductionist monocultural landscapes of extractivism. In arguing for a translation, translating outdoors as opposed to translating indoors, I want to kind of bring or expound further what my friend and colleague Sherry Simon has described as translation sites in her field guide, where she talks to follow my roots is to visit gardens, bridges and streets where spaces are charged with the tension between here and elsewhere. And to bring, if you like, Sherry Simon's notion of that field guide literally out into the fields and the meadows and the rivers and the streams, and to see the world as the endless theatre of these sites of translation, and that this, if you like, this form of translating outdoors is not simply something that is to do with, you know, what we might conceive of as the natural world, but also applies to the sites of urban habitation. In 2014, with Sherry Simon, we did a special issue of translation studies on translating the city. I think if one was to do another issue of this, what would be a suitable subject is translating the more than human city. In other words, to look at what translating outdoors in the city might look like. And one of the ways, one of the things it might look like is suggested by Alexandra Horowitz in her book on looking, 11 Walks with Expert Eyes, where she walks through a particular, a very small part of Manhattan, where she lives, again, with her immediate neighborhood. And she walks that same patch of ground in her neighborhood, typical classic kind of COVID-19 pandemic territory, with a child, a dog, an urban sociologist, an artist, a physician, a sound designer, and a naturalist. And what all of these, of course, these people do is they translate that urban space in different ways and awaken Horowitz's, opens our mind up not just to the kind of fractal human worlds that are there, but the fractal more than human worlds. And I think as part of that notion of translating outdoors and taking translation from indoors to outdoors is to look at the linguistic plurality of the outdoors, despite the fact that our cities are getting more and more and more multilingual. It is astonishing how many of those languages which densely occupy those outdoor spaces are absent from our translation curricula, are absent from translation research, are absent from the courses that are taught in our universities. So languages, major languages like Hindi, Urdu, Arabic, Farsi, Pashtun, Swahili, Hausa, Yoruba, how many of these languages, not to mention the many indigenous or endangered languages are taught or researched in institutional settings. The third form of minority that I want to consider, moving from place to axis, is the notion of positional minority. Positional minority is to do with the point from which you regard or think about the idea of translation and the environment. In a book, The Value of the Maori Language, a Maori language activist, Joseph Selwyn Teirito, speaks about the importance of the elders for the language. As our elders are repositories of our language, are to be highly valued. They're the experts, they're the ones who speak our language the most naturally and proficiently. They are exemplars. We cannot afford to be losing them at all, let alone at such a fast rate. So the kind of idea here is that classic one, that one of the things that is crucial is that we look and think about the value of knowledge that is transmitted or carried across time. But of course, one of the difficulties of that notion is that in environmental terms or in eco-political terms, that captures the experience of certain groups on the planet, but not others. And this is where I want to refer briefly to the work of a young Caribbean thinker, Malcolm Ferdinand, who has done work on what he calls decolonizing ecology. Basically, what Ferdinand argues is that there's a kind of a double rupture or dual fracture, he calls it, in ecological philosophy. On the one hand, there's a kind of, there is the environmental movement that's talking about the environmental damage to the planet, but that movement by and large ignores the reality of slavery and racial oppression. On the other hand, groups that are fighting against forms of racial oppression have traditionally tended to marginalize or neglect questions of ecological damage. So what he sees himself as doing in his work is bringing these two forms of critique to get together. So the term that he uses to describe, he doesn't use the term Anthropocene, he uses the term Plantationocene. So this is a term that was first formulated by Donna Haraway and a number of other thinkers at a conference in 2014. It talks about the devastating transformation of diverse kinds of human-tended farms, pastures and forests into extractive and closed plantations, relying on slave labor and other forms of exploited, alienated, and usually spatially translated labor. So in other words, what Haraway and Ferdinand argue is that fundamentally what the Anthropocene is about an extractivist paradigm. What created the kind of the conditions, the fullest expression of this extractivist paradigm was the kind of the institutional corporate organization of slavery and the kind of economic and industrial model that it gave rise to. But of course, at the heart of that, as Richard Grove has argued in his book on green imperialism, is the notion of translatio. It's the notion of the dual form of translation that allows the Plantationocene to happen. On the one hand is the physical transportation, movement of crops from one area to another. Removing things from one particular kind of ecological niche to another, and the creation, destruction of biocultural, destruction of ecological diversity and the creation of monocultures. And on the other, there is of course the physical displacement and translatio of 12.5 million slaves. So this notion then calls for, or what Ferdinand calls for, is a form of epistemic displacement, where you think about environmental crisis, you think about environmental destruction from the point of view of the Caribbean, from the historical experience of plantation, from the perspective of the Plantationocene. What I would argue is that in order to think about what he calls the third terms of modernity, translation comes into the picture. Because what he argues is that the experience of slaves and of slavery and racial, and those forms of racial oppression that come from it, was that the slaves were obviously people who weren't the beneficiaries of the kind of system, the plantation system that was created, the kind of privileged white moderns, nor were they the indigenous people who had been on these territories for many centuries. They were precisely people who found themselves caught in a world in between. And this experience of being in this particular place, finding themselves in this particular kind of relationship, is precisely the one that Maureen Denis, in her pioneering work on Caribbean translation thinking, defines as this what she calls the impossible entre deux des fictions créolitaires, where on the one hand you find a kind of language that's emerging, which is bears within it those kinds of translational pressures, but also the kinds of questions or dilemmas or interrogations that are posed to translation itself by the form, by the experience of being translated, if you like, into these particular spaces. So in other words, what Ferdinand is arguing for is shifting or tilting the kind of axis from which we regard or look at something like eco-translation. So it's this kind of positional minority that I want to talk about. Just a word or two about Cronin minority, all the more so because I'm aware of the fact that I'm running out of time as I want to talk about time. But this is basically the notion that one of the arguments that Dipesh Chakrabarty has made, that when the cumulative force of human activities is equivalent to the shift of tectonic plates or the eruption of a volcano, the humans are no longer biological agents, they become geological agents, then we have to think of human time as a continuum of geological time. We have to think about the cumulative force of human actions as now part of geological time. So we have to move from short-term historical time to long-term geological time. What I would argue is that one of the things that we need to think about in translation is precisely the notion of deep time into the past, in terms of when we talk about geology, when we talk about archaeology, when we talk about paleontology, are we not talking about forms of translation? Is this not a way of situating or thinking about these disciplines and these practices? Or do we need to think about them from an eco-translational perspective as part of the perspective of deep time? One of the ways in which this appears in contemporary literature is in, for example, Olga Tokarczuk's Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead, the Polish Nobel Prize winner, where she talks about the moment when she decides to go after the hunters who are decimating the animals in her border region between Poland and the Czech Republic. And she talks about this moment where they appeared before me like the stag to St. Hubert, to have me become the punitive hand of justice in secret, not just for the deers, but for other animals too, for they have no voice in Parliament. Well, basically, Janina, the heroine, who incidentally is translating Blake into Polish, but what this heroine translator is articulating is the fact that she sees these deers, the world around her, as part of a world that extends into deep time. It is like what Timothy Morton talks about, a kind of a hyper object, something that's extended in space and time, a kind of translational hyper object. And it's her role, if you like, to try and think about, to try and deal with, to try and mediate this. But precisely because she's a translator, she self-reflexively thinks about the fact of mediation. She self-reflexively thinks about the difficulties that are involved in those forms of representation and mediation. And one could argue this is similarly the case for our thinking into deep time into the future. One of the places that's described by Robert Macfarlane in his Underland is a site in New Mexico, which is a waste isolation project. And this is basically where nuclear waste is to be stored. It's going to be finally sealed in 2038. But the problem was, and this was, the idea was that this was not to be opened for another 10,000 years. But the problem is, how do you deal with the fact of making or warning people against the danger of accessing this material in 10,000 years' time. So a committee was set up, and so the idea was, how do you warn humans? So some people had this idea of pictograms or petroglyphs that mimicked, for example, Edvard Munch's the scream. The others was the proposal that there would be music played in the D minor chord, which is associated with, for humans, with sadness, that the winds of New Mexico playing to this wind instrument would produce something in D chord minor. And the other proposal that was put forward by the semiotician Thomas Sibiuk was the creation of a body of stories, of myths, that would be passed down from generation to generation, that would warn future generations of the dangers contained in this place. So in other words, there'd be creation almost kind of an atomic priesthood that would be responsible for what we might say is the translation through deep time of these stories and warnings. In other words, what Sibiuk and others thought about was the notion of literature, of translation, as a way of thinking about the environmental dimension or perspective to what was happening in terms of human extractivist activities. I would, having sort of looked at those different forms of minority, I just want to finish with Gorgo, who we started off with. And this is the voiceover that comes at the end of the film. A great city overwhelmed, exhausted, lies helpless under the immeasurable power and ferocity of this towering apparition from before the dawn of history. And yet, as though disdaining the pygmies under her feet, she turns back, turns with her young, leaving the prostrate city, leaving the haunts of man, and leaving man himself to ponder the proud boast that he alone is Lord of all creation. You're going back now, back to the sea. So the sea that the mother and child were going back to is the sea that is a mile from where I'm now speaking to you. It is, and I think to some extent it's fitting that it is a sea, it's a body of water. I think if we think of translation, not so much in terms of bridges, what I call the pontifical metaphor, the pontifex, the making of bridges between rigidly separated languages and cultures, and think about the sea in fluvial terms as a body of water that carries with it all kinds of materials from the different banks and organisms and things on both sides of the river. We come up with maybe a kind of a metaphorical way of thinking about translation that is liberating rather than reductive. But thank you for your patience in listening to me. Thank you very much.
Michael, thank you. What a wonderfully fertile and inspiring presentation. There have been a number of responses already, in particular to your focus on translating outdoors. And there's a first observation from Delia Chiaro. Quick observation, Michael, your argument on being indoors links up so well with what you discuss in a previous book, Translation and Globalization maybe, where in a pre-pandemic world, people would buy property all over the world in places where they didn't speak the language even, yet spend most of their lives within X kilometers of their living quarters. Great stuff.
Yes, no, I think it's one of the paradoxes, you know, the way in which, you know, particular forms of translation are always in tension with each other. You know, there's that kind of spatial translatio, but then it goes into tension with other forms of temporal translatio. Absolutely. Say hello to Delia.
A question from Luzmar Gonzalez as well. Thank you for this wonderful lecture, Michael. I'm intrigued by the difference between translating indoors and outdoors. Reading and writing are definitely affected by the physical space where we are, conditions of light, silence, noise, humidity, and so on. But I wonder if you could give us a concrete example of how being outdoors versus being indoors can affect translation.
Yeah, I think to some extent, let me give the example of a project that I'm getting involved here in Ireland, which is basically a project that's looking at the effect of wind farms on a particular community in the south of Ireland. But the community is understood as not simply or not only the human beings, but the more than human community, the kind of the animals, the insects, the birds, also the kind of the rivers, the trees, and so on. And one of the in thinking about in preparing my kind of submission to this, part of my submission was prepared, with pen and paper, with the computer inside. And then I began to sort of walk around the area that I live in. And parts of it are not dissimilar from the area that will be explored in this. And I was astonished at how much I was missing. I was astonished at how many things I'd neglected to include, how many things I'd left out. So these were, there were organisms, there were species, there were particular kind of interfaces and so on. In other words, a bit like Alexander Horowitz walking around your neighborhood in New York with these different, I began to realize that there was all kinds of things that I wasn't seeing. So I think one of the things that, translating outdoors and going to is not to look away, which I think happens so often when we translate indoor, but is to look again. Yeah. So, and of course, I mean, like all dichotomies, it's artificial. I mean, what I see the translating indoors as feeding into the translating outdoors, and the translating outdoors feeding. I mean, I see this as a both and rather than an either or activity. But I just think that it's something that we need to give thought to.
Thanks, Michael. There's a brief follow-up from Angela Curling. Is this wind farm project something you involve your translation students with?
Well, this is something that they will be involved in because I am recruiting a PhD student to work on the project with me, and I'm doing this with colleagues from engineering, from botany, from zoology, from computer science and the business school. And they will have research students. So those research students will be working together on this project. Yeah, so there will be a community there.
A question from Ye Tian. Professor Cronin's talk reminds me of the discussion over the binary of self, we the human, and other, the god, the monsters, nature, the environment. Carney calls for a narrative understanding capable of casting rope ladders and swing bridges across opposing extremes of self and other. Translation as a way of understanding seems to be the ladder and bridge which Carney seeks for.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thank you for that very, very important observation. I mean, to some extent, that really goes back to the driving impulse behind this project, behind my interest in developing or thinking about this notion of eco-translation, is that I was extremely aware of all of this work that was being done, particularly in the area of post-humanism, on relational ontology and the necessity for this. But it seemed to me that what was missing was was precisely thinking about the implications of that relationality, thinking about the kind of the challenges. And it seemed to me that that kind of the epistemic and the cognitive, the kind of experiential experience that translators and translation theorists of thinking about particular forms of communication across difference would be a very valuable contribution. On the other hand, the challenge for translation studies itself, as Carolyn said earlier, was to expand or to move beyond the kind of linguistic purview that had been largely being our preoccupation hitherto, and to think about this notion of translation in a more expanded way. And I think, and here I think, because it's important to state that in thinking about the eco-translation, and I think the absolute necessity to think about the very, very important conceptual work that's been done by people like Cobus Mare and Timo Maren and Cole and others, is the continuing contribution, vital contribution of translations and translators themselves to this debate. In other words, one of the things I find when I'm thinking about a lot of these questions is that again and again and again, I'm going back to my experience of reading translations, talking about translations, talking to translators in the translation center to inform the thinking about these questions.
Thank you. A question from Bajak Ergel. How does the phenomenon of the blogosphere relate to eco-translation, since the blogosphere is neither indoors or outdoors, but is a ground where both are represented? It seems to be our only ground of existence, is the claim, peoples and translators.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting observation, the kind of the hybridity of the blogosphere. And what's interesting is that the blogosphere is precisely one of those areas where there is debate around thinking outdoors, not so much about translating outdoors, but certainly thinking outdoors. The only caveat that I would enter is that I do think that there's a kind of phenomenological challenge in translating outdoors, which and what I mean by that is is physical translatio. It's the actual physically taking you from behind the screen and putting you outdoors, and that is it's a kind of it's a drive in thinking about that, because otherwise it sometimes can be a bit like, people writing about food, philosophers writing about comfort food. They talk about it as kind of social surrogate. That basically when you eat comfort food, it reminds you of happy experiences you had as a child, with your favorite aunt or with your granny or your grandfather, making a particular dish, and becomes a substitute for their absent presence. So I think sometimes we have to be to think about or be wary of the way in which our screens can become also, particular kinds of perhaps social surrogates as environmental surrogates.
Thank you. A question from Zilke Luhrmann in the chat about about the inside-outside distinction again, and how it might have been changed by precisely the COVID lockdown. And Zilke asked, but has lockdown also reversed the polarity of that inside-outside distinction in some ways, because now outdoor spaces are considered safer than indoor spaces?
Yes, I think that is true, but I wonder to what extent that will be, that's a kind of an instantaneous event or a durational one. I mean, in other words, to what extent is it a kind of an attribute of the particular nature of transmission, and in a post-vaccination world, will that reversal still obtain? I think, however, just to pick up on the very interesting observation, is that, and this kind of relates to a point that Carolyn was making earlier, which is the way in which one of the effects of confinement lockdowns is precisely to make us engage in these forms of vertical travel, to look at this immediate or proximate world around us, to make us curious about it. And I certainly know one of the things that's happened here in Ireland, and particularly in urban spaces, is that people have become more aware of that more than human world, if only because initially with the radical lockdown, with the disappearance of motor traffic and so on, and people could actually hear birdsong for the first time. There's no more airplanes in the sky too. So there was a kind of, as one was kept indoors, you were kind of you were forced to think about outdoors, because you were in effect brought to your immediate outdoors. So, I mean, and I can't overstress the link between the pandemic as a subset of that much larger set of ecological devastation. I think this has been radically underplayed in the media, the kind of the notion that it's back to business as usual. I mean, one of the, which is simply, it's not tenable. And I think one of the interesting differences, for example, between when I was a kid in Dublin, we got this leaflet in 1967. Tells you, I feel a bit like Yeats's 60-year-old smiling public man here, evoking 1967. But it was kind of, it was called, what to do in the event of nuclear war. And as a 7-year-old getting this, I was filled with abject terror. I mean, I was convinced that everybody around me would get nuked within weeks. But so and the way in which, the nuclear threat or peril was often talked about is you had this terrible thing, which was this impending menace, but then life would continue on as normal. That the ordinariness of life was contrasted with the terribleness of the nuclear peril. The difficulty with the ecological peril is it's precisely ordinary everyday life that's become a problem. It's continuing. It's staying calm and carrying on. It's not an option, is that you can't carry on as usual, because if you do, you'll have very good reasons not to stay calm going into the future.
Wonderful. A question on a different aspect, on the minority aspect that you were treating variously in your talk. This is Christina Valdez, how can translation contribute to preserving minority/minoritized languages within this eco-translation perspective?
Well, thank you for that question. Well, the answer to some extent has the question of this been answered by most of the indigenous communities that I've looked at or inquired into, which is they see as an absolutely central part of the language revitalization project is the use of translation, and this is for two reasons. One is that what translation does is that it allows their languages to grow and to expand and to engage with the multiple modernities that their speakers inhabit. Because the worst thing one can do with indigenous peoples, in the words of a very great Irish critic, Seamus Dean, who passed away yesterday, is to say that they should stay quaint and stay put. Right? Peoples, they inhabit multiple worlds, different places, and so on, and they need a language that's fit for purpose. So one of the important things that translation does is that it allows the language to grow and develop. But the other thing that translation does is that's a kind of generative role. The other role it has is a revelatory role, is that it's precisely when you start to work on the translation of indigenous texts, is that you realize the sheer fractal complexity of the languages, the language worlds, the kind of eco-semiospheres that these languages inhabit. And this is one of the things that, if you like, translators bring into view, that a translator describing the kinds of challenges that are posed by translating from a particular language, as you know, I mentioned earlier with the indigenous translator from Mexico, or for the work that's done in the Anishinaabe translation world. What that reveals is how extraordinarily valuable these languages are. And the crucial thing is it's not to do with salvage archaeology. It's not to do with the idea that we're going to save these languages from the past and then kind of preserve them in museum aspect. What translation is, and this is, all of the translators that I looked at, and I could have given you other quotes there in the lecture, they all talk about doing this for the future. These are, in the words of the Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, these are future-oriented cosmologies. These are future-oriented practices. It's how translation contributes to the creation of the viable future, rather than the entombment of a great lamented past.
Thank you, Michael. I think we have time just for one more question. And this is from Enrique Ferrara. Thank you, Michael, for an inspiring talk about relational ontology. According to the physics philosopher Karen Barad, who grounds her relational theory of the subject on quantum physics, all humans and non-humans are entangled in the world of phenomena. Could language be considered part of such entanglement, so that translation is nothing other than the epistemic enactment of these life entanglements?
Yeah, thanks, Enrique, for that very, very important question. This is the Jennifer Deere in a very good book that came out very, very recently called Radical Animism, makes precisely this point where she talks about when we talk about the more than human, that it's very, very important that we don't just think about in terms of humans and animals. We've got to think about the inorganic world, like the kind of the material world out there, and that, you know, what Jane Bennett talks about, active material ism, and Karen Barad talks about a gentle realism. The notion that what we inhabit, and this is, you know, what the scientists have shown us, is that we inhabit this profoundly animated world, and that what the eco-semiosphere, in a sense, is talking about is the necessity to think about those forms of relationality. And I completely agree with Enrique Ferrara in that respect. It seems to me that translation is absolutely central to how we think about those forms of entanglement. And it's something, again, if you like, in a discipline, in a way of thinking that's often been minoritized. You can see how the kind of the minor mode, in fact, is a way of illuminating major problems, because that was when Heisenberg was and Niels Bohr were thinking about conceptualizing quantum mechanics, and developing what was known as the Copenhagen interpretation. What they basically argued for was a form of physics, or a new thinking about physics that was to do with translation. And translation, meaning by that, what you could know, what was possible to know, and what it wasn't possible to know, and in terms of what it wasn't possible to know, how you negotiated that and how that depended very much on perspective and the kind of positional minority that I talked about earlier. But no, I couldn't agree more. I think that's absolutely central to the question.
Okay, I think we're going to need to draw this session, and indeed the first day of our conference, to a close at this point. Thank you once again, Michael, for a truly inspiring talk, and indeed for your inspirational work more generally, which has given us such a lot to think about and to talk about at this conference.